The map was wrong about almost everything except the line itself. She'd found it 3 weeks earlier in a library discard bin outside a branch in Roseburg, a 1947 survey chart, folded badly and foxed at the edges, the kind of document that gets weeded from a collection when someone decides it no longer serves any practical purpose. She'd almost left it there. She'd reached into the bin for something else entirely, a road atlas missing its cover, and her fingers had come back with this instead. A fragile paper thing that crinkled when she unfolded it. Thin as onion skin printed in the pale blue ink of a government survey office that had probably been defunded and reorganized out of existence 20 years ago. She'd stood in the parking lot of that library for a long time holding the map flat against the wind, reading it the way she'd been taught to read drawings. Not for the information on the surface, for the information underneath. The survey showed the cascades and cross-section ridge lines and drainage patterns, and the dotted contour lines that told you where the land was thinking about becoming something steeper than it already was. She knew how to read contour lines. That was one of the things she'd actually learned before she stopped going to her classes at Oregon State, how to look at a two-dimensional drawing and understand the three-dimensional thing it was trying to describe. How to see the elevation in the interval. How a hillside that looked gentle on paper could turn vertical the moment you were standing on it with 40 pounds on your back. The line appeared near the eastern margin of the survey. A thin pencil scratch, freehand rather than mechanical running east through the mountains and then simply ending. No junction name, no destination, no notation explaining what it was or who had drawn it or why it ran where it ran. Just a line that started somewhere off the left edge of the paper and terminated in what the contours told her was a high mountain valley, maybe 5,000 feet above sea level. Somewhere in the Umpqua National Forest, someone had written 3 words along the line in pencil, so faint she'd had to tilt the paper toward the sun to read it. Cutter Pass Spur. She'd folded the map, carefully reversing the original creases, rather than fighting them, and put it in the front pocket of her canvas jacket. She'd been walking for 6 weeks by then. She had no particular destination. She had a backpack she'd bought from a church rummage sale and reinforced herself with salvaged leather strapping a sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees that she'd found in a donation bin, a folding knife, a hand-drawn notebook of useful things, and enough food for 3 days if she was careful about it. She'd weighed the pack on a postal scale at a feed store in Belden before starting the climb into the mountains. 41 pounds. She'd stood there in the cool interior of that store with the scales needle resting on the number and thought about what 41 pounds meant in practical terms. It meant she could carry it. It meant she could sustain this for longer than most people thought was reasonable. It meant she had made good decisions about what to bring and what to leave behind. She liked knowing the weight of things. She liked knowing the weight of everything. That was the part of architecture school she had actually loved. Not the design studios where everyone wanted to make statements. Not the history lectures that treated buildings like frozen arguments about the nature of civilization. She had loved the structures courses. The ones where you learned how things held together, how load transferred through a column, how a beam deflected under stress, how a joint either worked or it didn't, and how you could tell the difference by understanding the forces involved. She had filled 3 notebooks with calculations and structural diagrams in the year and a half before she'd stopped going. She still carried one of those notebooks, the hand-drawn one, the useful things one. She'd torn out the calculations and replaced them with other information trail notes, weather observations, the kind of practical knowledge that accumulated when you were moving through a landscape every day and paying attention to what it was telling you. She wrote in it every evening. Not a journal exactly, more like a running inventory of what she knew and what she still needed to figure out. The climb from the valley floor had taken most of a morning. She left the gravel logging road at a creek crossing and followed the drainage upward through second-growth fir, the kind of forest that told you something had happened here before the trees too uniform in age, too regular in spacing, the understory still catching up with itself. A logged-over forest recovering from something it hadn't chosen. She understood the feeling. The grade steepened as she climbed. She found the old grader's work in the landscape and followed it the perfectly uniform slope never more than 2%. The gentle curves that avoided hard turns, the shallow cuts through ridge spurs where patient men with dynamite and hand drills had convinced the mountain to cooperate. This was how a railroad grade looked from the inside, from the construction side. She could read it the way some people read books, one careful detail at a time, each feature telling her something about the people who had made it and how they had thought about the problem of moving heavy loads through difficult terrain. Someone had built this line with patience and real craft, and then the world had simply forgotten it. The rails were still there in places, half buried in duff and overrun with brush, but still they're still spiked down to ties that had gone silver and soft with decades of weather. She walked between them when she could, stepping from tie to tie, feeling the strange pleasure of following a path that no one else had followed in a very long time. The trees on either side had grown up through the right-of-way young firs, pushing in from the margins, reclaiming the cleared corridor inch by inch. In another 50 years, maybe less, there would be no visible trace. But for now, on a cold October morning in the mountains of southern Oregon, you could still follow the line, if you knew what you were looking for. She had her jacket collar up and her hands in her pockets between the moments when she needed them for balance on the uneven ground. The morning had come in with frost on the rail ties and breath that hung in the air like smoke. She could see maybe a quarter mile ahead before the trees closed in and the grade curved away out of sight. The sky above the right-of-way was a narrow strip of gray, the kind of gray that meant weather was coming but hadn't decided exactly when. She wasn't worried about the weather. She had learned not to be worried about the weather. Weather was a condition you worked within, not a problem you solved. You dressed for it, you moved with it, you found shelter when it required shelter, and you kept going when it didn't. The mountains didn't care about your schedule, and you learned to stop caring about your schedule too. She had been following this line for 2 days. The first day had been straightforward. The grade was clear and the walking was good, and she'd covered 12 miles before the light started going, and she'd made camp in a shallow cut between two ridge spurs, hanging her food and sleeping in the bag with her jacket on and not being cold enough to be miserable. The second day had been harder. The grade crossed a series of avalanche paths where decades of snowslides had scoured the right-of-way clean of everything. Rails and ties and ballast all carried downhill together, leaving bare rock that she'd had to work around. She'd lost 2 hours picking her way along the margins, but she'd found the line again on the far side of the last avalanche path, and she'd been following it since. And now the fog that had been chasing her up the mountain all morning had caught her. It came in around mid-morning, rising from the canyon below, and it softened everything. The tree line, the ridge above the distance ahead, until she was walking in a corridor of gray that extended maybe 50 feet in either direction before the world dissolved. She walked with her head down, watching the ties for loose spikes and rot. This was how she covered ground. Not looking far ahead to where she was going, looking right in front of her at the next safe step at the condition of the things she was standing on. She had learned this from the mountain. You could exhaust yourself looking at the summit. You kept moving by watching your feet. The ground fell away on either side before she registered what was happening. She looked up and stopped. The rails continued forward over nothing. The trestle emerged from the fog on either side of her tall timber bents, descending into gray, the deck stretching forward across a canyon she couldn't see the bottom of. The far end of the bridge disappeared into the fog 20 yards ahead. She could hear water. She couldn't see it. She could hear it the way you hear something large and indifferent, not loud exactly, but present in a way that the fog couldn't muffle. A low, continuous sound that came up through the rock and the timber and the soles of her boots and made itself known without announcing itself. She stood at the approach to the trestle for a long moment and looked at it. The structure was old, older than the survey map she thought her about, as old the timber bents built from fir logs 12 inches or more in diameter, hand-peeled and set into the canyon walls with a precision that had held for decades. She could see the cross-bracing between the bents, the sway bracing the deck system of stringers and ties. She knew the vocabulary for this. She'd studied timber trestle construction in her second year, a 3-week unit on vernacular infrastructure that most of her classmates had considered beside the point. She had filled a notebook. What she saw in front of her was a structure that had been built to carry the weight of loaded ore cars across a canyon that would have otherwise stopped a railroad dead. Someone had looked at this gap in the mountain, this 200-foot drop to a river running below, and had said, "We can cross this. We can build something that will hold." And they had. And then the railroad had ended or been abandoned or been bought out and stripped, and the trestle had been left here standing in the fog, holding its own weight and nothing else. She stepped onto the deck carefully. Her hand found the outside rail, and she let it guide her, testing each tie before trusting her weight. The old timber was harder than she expected. Dense with age, dark with decades of weather, spiked down with square-cut iron that had rusted into the wood so thoroughly that the tie and the spike had become a single thing. She moved forward slowly, deliberately, one step at a time. She was halfway across when the storm arrived. It came without warning, the way mountain storms did, not building from a distance, but simply appearing fully formed, as if it had been waiting just around a corner of the atmosphere. The wind hit first hard off the canyon wall, then the rain came sideways, and the fog turned to something heavier, and the trestle shuddered once, a long, slow vibration that she felt in her sternum before she heard it. She dropped instinctively. This was not a decision she made. Her body made it for her, the deep animal part that understood exposure and height and the relationship between the two. She got down low and pressed herself against the deck, her face turned sideways against the wet timber, both hands finding the inside of the rail and holding it. The rain hammered her back and ran down her neck inside her collar, and the wind tried to get under her jacket and find the warmth there. She stayed still. This was the other thing the mountains had taught her. When conditions became serious, the worst thing you could do was make a rapid decision. You stayed where you were. You assessed. You waited for the information to improve before you acted on it. She had learned this the hard way on a ridgeline in the Siskiyous in August, when she'd made a fast decision in a lightning storm, and it had cost her most of a day and a turned ankle, and a long wet night that she still thought about sometimes when she was trying to fall asleep. She pressed herself flat against the ties and pulled her jacket over her head and waited. The rain came down hard enough to blur the difference between the bridge and the sky. The canyon below was invisible. The far end of the bridge was invisible. There was nothing in the world except the sound of water and wind, and the low structural groan of the trestle working in the gusts, and her own breathing, and the feel of old wet timber against her cheekbone. That was when she saw it. Not the whole thing at first, just a shape. A corner of something that wasn't wood, wasn't rust, wasn't stone. She turned her face more fully sideways and squinted. The rain was in her eyes. She blinked it away and looked again. Between two of the heavy crossbeams, half buried under a layer of grit and dead lichen, and what looked like decades of accumulated debris, there was a panel. Dark metal, roughly square, perhaps 18 inches across. Set flush into the framework of the bridge so precisely that from any normal walking angle, head up moving forward, watching the ties, it would have been invisible. Just another dark patch between the timbers. Just the shadow where two structural members met. But she wasn't walking, she was lying down. Her eye was at deck level, looking sideways into the structure. And from that angle and that light, with rain flattening everything and stripping away the shadows that normally made the surface of the deck, a single unified thing, she could see that this was different. That this didn't belong to the structure, that this had been placed here. She reached toward it without thinking. Her fingers found the surface. Cold metal. The grit shifted under her fingertips and fell away into the dark below. Not just surface rust on what she touched, the deep oxidation that happened when iron and moisture shared a long and undisturbed relationship. But the edges were straight. Too straight to be accidental, too straight to be a piece of the original construction. The original ironwork on the trestle was rough-cut and irregular. The visible economy of builders working fast with materials that were good enough, but not more than good enough. This was different. This had been cut with care. She felt along the near side, and her fingers found a recessed ring, flat against the surface, hinged so it could be lifted. She lay there for a moment with rain hammering her back and water running past her knuckles, and the river making its invisible noise far below, and she thought about what she was doing. She thought about it seriously, the way she tried to think about things that mattered. This was a metal panel set into the underside of a railroad bridge deck in what appeared to be a deliberate and concealed manner by a person or persons unknown at an unknown point in the past for an unknown purpose. The reasonable response to discovering such a thing in such conditions was probably not to immediately try to open it. The reasonable response was to note its existence, mark the location, and think carefully about what it meant before doing anything further. She got her fingers under the ring and pulled. Nothing. The thing was either welded shut or had simply seized with decades of rust and inertia. She pulled harder, bracing her other hand against the adjacent beam, and felt something shift, not much but enough. Not welded, just resisting. She worked at it. 2 minutes, maybe three, with rain running down her neck and the wind pushing at her from the canyon below and the whole structure creaking around her. She worked methodically, pulling in a steady direction, and then releasing, pulling and releasing the way you'd work a stuck bolt, not forcing it, just introducing movement, convincing the thing that it could give. She was good at this kind of patience. She had always been good at this kind of patience. And then, with one long protesting shriek of metal on metal that she felt sure could be heard from the valley floor, the hatch opened. She looked down into darkness. Looked. Not an empty darkness. After a moment, with the gray stormlight filtering through the open hatch above her, she could make out a ladder. Iron rungs set directly into rock. Not timber. Rock. The bridge was anchored to an outcropping that jutted from the canyon wall, and someone had built down into that stone, had drilled holes and set iron rods and created a ladder that descended into the living rock of the canyon. The ladder went down maybe 15 feet before it met a surface she couldn't read from above. A floor, she thought, flat and level, the horizontal surface of something that had been made rather than found. She lay at the edge of the hatch for a long moment with one hand on the ring and cold water streaming past her knuckles, and thought very carefully about what a reasonable person would do. A reasonable person would not climb down an unknown ladder into a hole carved in the rock of a canyon wall on a railroad bridge in the middle of an October storm in a mountain range where nobody knew she was. A reasonable person would close the hatch, mark the location in the notebook she kept in her jacket, and continue down the mountain to somewhere with roads and people and the basic infrastructure of ordinary life. She got her boots over the edge and found the first rung. It held. Cold under her hands, but solid, the iron seated firmly in the drilled rock. The second rung held. The third. She pulled the hatch down over her head as she descended, not closing it fully, just enough to cut the worst of the rain, and she felt the storm recede above her, muffled, now theoretical, the way weather became when rock was between you and it. The darkness thickened with each step. She counted rungs without thinking about it. 7, 8, 9. Her boots found the floor on 12. She stood still and waited for her eyes to do their work. The darkness wasn't total. She understood this after maybe 30 seconds of standing still in it, letting herself adjust, resisting the urge to move before she could see. There was a seam of pale light somewhere ahead, thin as a knife blade. Not much, but enough to give the dark a shape, enough to tell her that she was in an enclosed space with a ceiling low enough that she could feel it without touching it, and walls close enough on both sides that she could extend her arms and find them. She could make out the floor beneath her boots, pale stone cut almost level with the slight imperfection of work done by hand tools in difficult conditions. She could make out the rough walls pressing close. She could make out the ceiling just clearing her head by a few inches, the rock above scored with chisel marks that hadn't been smoothed away. She took one step forward, then another. The passage opened. She felt it before she saw it. The air changed, the closeness falling away on both sides, and she understood she had moved from a corridor into a room. She moved to the wall and followed it with her fingertips, slow and deliberate, the way you moved in the dark, and her fingers found a shelf. And on the shelf, her knuckles knocked against something that skittered and almost fell, and she caught it. A candle. A glass jar with a candle set inside it. She patted the shelf more carefully and found what she was hoping for. A small box of matches. Cardboard slightly damp, but not wet through. She took her time with the first match, sheltered the flame with both hands and touched it to the wick. The wick took slowly, reluctantly then, with a small, steady pull. The room came up around her. It wasn't large. She estimated 12 feet by 14 with the low ceiling continuing overhead, except in the center where someone had chipped the rock upward to make a kind of vault, just enough height to stand fully upright. The walls were natural canyon stone, but things had been done to them. Shelves had been cut directly from the rock, supplemented with rough timber planking bolted into drilled holes. A cast iron wood stove sat against the far wall, its stovepipe disappearing upward into a channel that had been bored through the rock heading. She realized towards some crevice in the canyon wall where smoke could escape unseen. Beside the stove was a small stack of split wood dry as chalk. On the shelves in the wavering yellow light she could see cans, dozens of them, unlabeled, their lids sealed with what looked like wax. Beside them, glass jars. Beside those, folded cloth. Beside that, tools arranged in order of size on a strip of pegboard mounted to the stone. And at the far wall, almost invisible until she moved the candle toward it, a window. Narrow, horizontal, cut from the stone like an embrasure in a fort, angled slightly downward so that a person standing inside could see out without being seen from below. She stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, holding the candle up, letting her shadow move large across the ancient rock behind her. She was an architecture student, former architecture student, who had spent a year and a half learning how buildings express the intentions of the people who built them. Every choice left a record. The height of a ceiling told you something about how the builder understood the human body. The organization of storage told you something about how the builder understood time. The placement of a window told you something about what the builder was watching for and what they were hiding from. She stood in this room for a long time before she moved. Then she moved to the window first because the window seemed most important. She pressed her face close to the narrow gap in the stone and looked through. The canyon opened below her. The storm was still running, but the rock cut the wind, and what she saw through the embrasure was something close to a vista canyon. Walls dropping 200 feet to a river she could now finally see running green and pale through the last gray light. White foam where it broke around boulders. Cottonwood trees along the near bank, their leaves still trembling from the rain, the pale gold of October just beginning to fade to brown. The river was narrow from up here, a thread of silver stitched through the canyon floor. And the sound she'd been hearing since she dropped through the hatch, that low, continuous roar she'd assumed was wind, was the river. Not wind, the river. It was the sound the whole place breathed. She pulled back from the window and began to work. She started with the shelves because that was where you started, at the edges of an unknown space moving toward the center. The cans were hand-sealed, the rim of each lid coated in a thin layer of brownish wax applied with care. She lifted one and shook it gently and heard the dense shift of something solid inside. Beans or corn. The glass jars beside them were sealed with rubber gasketed lids, and through the dark glass she could make out pale shapes suspended in liquid. Vegetables put up in brine. She set a jar down carefully, as if it were borrowed. The tools on the pegboard strip were simple but complete. A handsaw, its teeth still sharp when she tested them with her thumbnail. A claw hammer, the handle worn smooth and dark from use. A hatchet, a wood plane, a coil of braided wire, a canvas roll secured with a leather strap that, when she unrolled it across the floor, revealed an organized set of chisels and punches arranged by size. Someone had assembled this kit deliberately, with the same logic she'd used when she was packing her own pack, thinking through what would be needed not for a specific task, but for an extended period of sustained, varied work. This wasn't a cache thrown together in haste. This was a kit made by someone who knew the difference between having a tool and needing a tool and not having it. Below the workbench, she found a drawer she'd missed flush with the wood without a handle. She worked it open with a flathead from the tool rack. Inside, 3 keys on a plain ring, a folded piece of oilcloth, and a stub of pencil worn nearly to the metal ferrule. The oilcloth held a hand-drawn map, not of the bridge, not of the room, but of the canyon itself. The river, the ridgeline above, a dotted trail climbing from the riverbank below to a point somewhere north of the bridge, marked with a small square. Beside it, two letters written in pencil so small she had to bring the candle close. DC. She didn't know what that meant. She added it to her notebook anyway. That was the rule she'd made for herself in 6 weeks of moving through landscapes that didn't explain themselves. Write down the things you don't understand. Write them down precisely, without interpretation, without the assumption that you know more than you do. The meaning would come. And when it came, she wanted the original observation intact, uncorrupted by what she'd decided it meant before she knew. She found the wooden box last. It had been underneath the dry goods in the second crate, set flat against the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. She sat on the floor with it across her knees and worked the knot loose slowly. Her fingers were stiff with the cold. Inside the oilcloth was a wooden box about the size of a Bible, the wood smoothed and darkened with handling. The lid fit with a precision that spoke of someone who understood joinery, the kind of fit you didn't get by accident, only by cutting things twice and checking them against each other until they matched. Inside were papers. The top sheet was a hand-drawn diagram. The bridge, the canyon, a cross-section of the rock face showing the cavity and profile. Measurements noted in pencil with a draftsman's precision, dimensions and angles, recorded in a hand that was careful and confident. Below the diagram were smaller sketches. The hatch mechanism, the chimney channel, the window frame with its angled sill. The draftsmanship was patient. These weren't rough field notes. They were a record made after the work was finished, as if someone had documented what they'd built so that another person could understand it without explanation. She held the candle close and studied the drawings. The section drawing of the hatch mechanism was particularly good. It showed the ring assembly, the counterweight system, that should have made the hatch easier to open from below, the way the frame had been recessed so that from above it sat flush with the deck. Whoever had drawn this had drawn it for someone who needed to understand it from the outside. From the finding it end, not the building it end. She set the plans aside and looked at the next sheet, a list written in a different hand, or the same hand but older. The pen pressed harder, the letters less. Even the line spacing inconsistent in a way that suggested the writer had been doing this over time, coming back to it, adding entries as they accumulated. Names of towns she didn't recognize scattered across what she guessed was a rough 100-mile radius from where she was sitting. Some towns had check marks beside them. Others were crossed out. She read the list twice without understanding it. The logic of the marks didn't follow any geographic pattern. The check marks and the cross-outs were distributed without apparent order across what should have been a comprehensible region. She stared at it for a long time, tilting the candle to different angles, as if the right light might reveal the organizing principles she was missing. It didn't. She copied the list into her notebook, every entry exactly as written, including the marks beside each town. Then she found the photograph. It was at the bottom of the box, face down, edges curled. Black and white, the emulsion starting to silver in the corners. She turned it over and held it close to the candle. Two men on what was clearly this bridge. She could see the canyon behind them, the far wall, the distinctive angle of the trestle approach. The image was sharp enough that she could make out the structural details, the same bent configuration she'd walked across, the same deck system, the same railings she'd used to guide herself through the fog. She looked at the men. They were standing maybe 4 feet apart, not posed, not looking at the camera together. One of them was looking directly at the lens, a man in work clothes, heavy set through the shoulders, a cap pulled low, his expression not exactly a smile, but something adjacent to one. The other man was not looking at the camera at all. He was looking out toward the canyon, his profile to the lens, watching something on the far rim or in the air above it that the photograph didn't show. And on his left lapel, she brought the candle closer, angling the photograph to reduce the glare, a small round badge, pinned flat. She couldn't read the text at this resolution in this light, but she knew the shape. She had seen that shape on her father's old union card tucked into the back of his wallet, where he'd kept it for years after the mill closed. She'd asked him about it once. He hadn't said much. That was a union badge, a steel workers' union badge, she was almost certain. On the lapel of the man looking away from the camera on a railroad bridge in the mountains in the year, written on the back of the photograph in a hand she didn't recognize. Spring 1959. She turned the photograph over. That was all it said. No names, no location, just the season and the year and the confident backward slant of someone who wrote the same way they did everything else without wasting space. She set the photograph down carefully on the workbench and held the candle up and looked at the room with new eyes. She had been thinking of this place as abandoned, as something left behind by accident or neglect, the way old things got left behind when the world moved on and the people who had made them moved with it. But the drawings, the list, the photograph together told a different story. This place hadn't been forgotten. It had been built deliberately with tremendous labor and sustained commitment by at least two men who knew exactly what they were building and exactly why they were building it in secret. The draftsmanship alone would have taken weeks. The construction carving that alcove into solid rock beneath a working railroad bridge, running a concealed chimney channel through 30 feet of canyon wall, fitting a hatch that would be invisible from the deck, would have taken months. Done quietly, done at night, done in seasons when the line ran less frequently. Done, she now understood, by men who were used to working under difficult conditions, who had the skills to work stone and iron and timber, who had a reason to need a place that no one else knew about. And on the lapel of one of them, a Union badge. In 1959. She sat back on her heels in the middle of the stone floor and let the candle burn and thought about what she knew and what she didn't. She knew how to read a building. She knew how to read a structure. She knew that the choices embedded in this room, the placement of the window, the organization of the stores, the completeness of the toolkit, the quantity of food described a place intended to support a person or several people for an extended period of time. Months, not days. Through a winter, possibly. This was not a cache for a hunting trip. This was not a romantic adventure hidden under a bridge. This was a serious place built by serious people for a serious purpose. The candle had burned down enough that she could see the wax pooling in the base of the jar. She would need to ration what she had. She capped her pen and tucked the notebook into her jacket pocket and listened to the storm working itself out above her. Outside the narrow window, the river moved in the dark. She was stiff from sitting on the floor. She moved to the chair, a simple thing, 4 legs and a back, and a seat of woven cord that had dried into something hard as wood, and sat down and leaned her head back against the stone wall behind it. She told herself she was resting her eyes for a few minutes. She was asleep before the candle went all the way down. She woke to gray light, not the gray of the storm. This was the particular gray of mountain morning, thin and clear and cold, the kind of light that came after weather had moved through and taken its energy with it and left everything rinsed clean and very still. It came through the narrow window at an angle that told her it was early, 7 o'clock, maybe a little before. She sat up straight in the chair and let her body remember where she was. Stone walls, a ceiling just above her head, the smell of cold ash and old food, and something mineral that was simply the smell of the rock itself, ancient and dry and patient, in a way that nothing above ground ever quite smelled. The candle was long cold in its jar. The notebook was still in her jacket pocket, pressed against her ribs where she'd slept on it. She was warmer than she'd been in days. That alone felt like something worth paying attention to. The stone held temperature in a way that wood didn't. The room had started cold when she'd entered it, but the residual heat from the brief fire she'd lit to test the flue, a few strips of birch bark, just enough to check the draw, had combined with her own body heat over the hours of her sleep, and the result was the particular warmth of enclosed stone spaces, deeper and steadier than anything a fire alone could produce. The mountain had kept her warm. She stood stretched until something in her back released with a sound like a knuckle cracking and moved to the window. In the early morning light, the river below was visible for the first time, narrow and fast pale green where it caught the early sky threading between dark boulders at the base of the canyon. She could see the gravel bar where the water ran wide and shallow on the near bank. The canyon walls on the far side were dense with old-growth Engelmann spruce, The kind of growth that told you the timber had been left alone for a very long time. A forest that hadn't been touched in living memory. She opened her notebook to the sketch she'd made of the oilcloth map and held it up against the view. The river bend in the drawing matched the one below. The ridge line above the bridge matched the silhouette of the far canyon wall. The dotted trail on the map climbed northeast along the east bank from somewhere near the waterline. And the small square marked DC was somewhere up there, in the trees, on the slope above the river, not far on paper. She looked at the photograph one more time in the morning light. The two men on the bridge, the Union badge on the lapel of the one who wasn't looking at the camera. The man who wasn't looking at the camera was looking out at the canyon, at something on the far rim or in the air or somewhere in the distance that the photograph couldn't show. There was something in his posture that she recognized without being able to name. The careful stillness of a person watching for something they expected to see eventually. The patience of someone who had learned to wait. She put the photograph back in the box and the box back in the crate and shouldered her pack. She climbed the iron ladder and pushed the hatch up into the morning light and stood on the bridge and breathed the cold air coming off the mountain. The storm had taken everything loose with it. The rails were clean and dark with moisture, the ties gleaming. She could see the full length of the trestle now 200 feet from wall to wall, the canyon below showing her the river she'd been hearing for 12 hours without seeing. The water was moving fast and green, still carrying the color of the snowmelt that had fed it weeks ago. She stood there for a moment with the canyon below and the clean morning around her, in the map in her pocket, in the photograph working in her memory. Two men in 1959, one badge, one averted gaze, and somewhere up the East Bank Trail, a small square with two letters beside it that she didn't yet understand. She would follow the dotted line. Not because she had a plan, not because she knew what she was looking for, but because she had followed the rails when the sensible thing was to turn around, and she had gone through the hatch when the sensible thing was to leave it closed, and both of those decisions had led her somewhere worth being. She closed the hatch carefully, lowered it until she heard the faint click of the ring settling back into its recess. From above it disappeared, just another shadow between the timbers. She moved to the east end of the trestle and found the narrow path dropping down through the brush into the canyon, and she followed it down toward the sound of the river, toward whatever a small square and two initials had meant to the man who had carved them onto a piece of oilcloth and hidden it in a drawer under a workbench in a room that no one was supposed to find. The path down to the river was not a game trail. She understood this within the first 50 yards. The width was wrong, too consistent, too deliberate. The ground packed in a way that spoke of repeated human use, rather than the random passage of deer moving between water and bedding. Deer trails wandered. They followed the path of least resistance in the moment, responding to smell and sound and the particular geometry of a deer's instincts about where safety was. This trail did not wander. It switched back twice through dense spruce, with the economical logic of someone who understood grade, who knew that a trail cutting straight down a steep slope was a trail that would wash out in the first hard rain, and who had built accordingly. Someone had walked this route many times, and someone had thought about how to build it so that it would still be walkable after they stopped. She followed the switchbacks down through the timber, the spruce closing overhead, until the morning sky was reduced to a narrow slot of pale blue directly above the trail. The air was colder in the canyon than it had been on the bridge. The canyon walls held the cold the way they'd held the heat underground steadily without opinion. She could see her breath. She kept her hands in her pockets between the moments when she needed them for balance on the loose rock. The trail leveled along the riverbank, where the canyon widened slightly and the water ran across a gravel bar. She stopped here and oriented herself. The river was higher than she had expected from the window view. The rain had done that. She knew the canyon drainage, adding its volume to whatever was already running. The water was the pale green of glacial flour mixed with the amber of tannins from the forest above, and it moved with the particular purposeful urgency of mountain water that had somewhere to be. She held the oilcloth map open against her knee and matched what she saw to what was drawn. The river bend, the gravel bar, the angle of the canyon wall above the bridge, it all corresponded. The dotted trail on the map ran north from approximately this point following the east bank upstream. She folded the map carefully and put it back in her jacket pocket and turned north. The walking was good along the bank. The gravel was firm underfoot, and the river kept her oriented, and the morning light was improving the sun getting above the canyon rim and sending long horizontal shafts through the spruce on the far wall. She moved at the steady pace she'd developed over 6 weeks of distance walking, not fast enough to be working hard, not slow enough to be wandering. The pace she could sustain all day without making decisions about it. After 20 minutes, the trail bent inland and climbed a low shelf above the waterline. The vegetation changed as she climbed the shelf, thinner trees, more light, the spruce giving way to stands of young aspen, whose leaves had already turned and were just beginning to let go. The ground was softer here, the mineral soil of the riverbank giving way to something darker and more complex. And when she looked down at the trail she was following, she noticed that the packed quality of it had changed too. She was walking on something that had been walked on more recently than the path below. She stopped. There was a clearing ahead that should not have existed. Not here, not in this canyon where every available flat space was either riverbank gravel or the root-tangled floor of dense spruce forest. She could see it through the last of the trees, an opening maybe 60 feet across, where the light fell differently because there was nothing overhead to block it. She approached slowly the way she had learned to approach things she didn't yet understand. From the edge first, looking before stepping. The clearing was not natural. The spruce had been cut back decades ago and the stumps had rotted nearly flat, but the clearing itself remained open. She could see why the grass that covered the floor was tall and thick, the kind of growth that came when ground had been worked and enriched and then left to find its own level. But beneath the grass emerging where the grass was thinnest near the edges, she could make out structure, the straight lines of something that didn't occur in nature. She walked in from the south end and understood within 3 steps. Raised beds. 12 of them arranged in 2 parallel rows of 6 built from logs that had long since silvered and sunk partly into the soil. The logs were 8 inches in diameter, at least peeled and stacked too high, the corners notched in the simple half-lap that any competent woodworker could cut with a handsaw and a chisel. The beds were overgrown, the grass and the wild asters, and the volunteer fireweed having filled them to the same level as everything else, but the structure remained. The spacing was logical. The orientation was south-facing, angled to catch maximum light through the narrow canyon window. Whoever had laid this out had understood how light moved through a north-south canyon and had positioned accordingly. Someone had farmed here. She moved through the rows slowly. The soil in the beds was darker than the surrounding ground, visibly different, the deep, almost black of soil that had been amended with organic matter over several growing seasons and then left to hold what it had been given. Still rich-looking despite years of neglect. She pressed her palm flat into the nearest bed and felt the moisture in it, the life in it, the particular quality of good cultivated ground that persisted long after cultivation stopped. This had not been an accident. This had been thought about. Someone had looked at this piece of canyon floor, the light, the drainage, the soil, and had understood what it could become with work, and had done the work. She stood between the rows for a moment and looked at the clearing as a whole. The raised beds, the south orientation, the residual richness of the soil, the same deliberateness she'd found in the room under the bridge, the same application of technical knowledge to a practical problem, the same quality of care that said, this person knew what they were doing and had a reason to do it that extended past the immediate moment. Along the far edge of the clearing, she found the structure the map had marked. It was barely visible beneath a collapse of brush in a birch tree that had grown up through the corner of it, lifting one wall several inches off its foundation in the slow, patient way trees had of taking back the ground that had been taken from them. A cache shed, low-roofed, built from flat stones mortared with what looked like clay and coarse sand. The whole thing no larger than a garden shed, maybe 8 feet by 10, with walls that had settled and cracked in the years since anyone had last tended them, but had not essentially failed. The door was a single plank hung on hand-forged hinges, swollen shut with years of absorbed moisture. She worked it open with her shoulder leaning into it steadily, until she felt the wood give not breaking, but releasing the way waterlogged wood did when you applied the right pressure in the right direction. She stood in the doorway while her eyes adjusted. Shelves along two walls. Mostly empty now, the exposed wood gone gray and furred with the fine mold of decades, but structurally intact, the same drilled and bolted mounting system she'd seen in the room under the bridge, the same logic of using the wall itself as the primary structural element. A rusted hand cultivator hung from a nail near the door. Two ceramic crocks on the lower shelf sealed with wax-dipped cloth that had dried to a pale brown. And on the highest shelf, in the far corner where the light from the doorway barely reached, a small tin box with a hasp latch. She looked at the tin box for a moment. Then she looked at the crocks. She chose the crocks first. Not because the tin box was less interesting. It was obviously more interesting, obviously the thing her attention wanted to go to, but because the crocks were sealed, still intact after what might have been decades, and that kind of care deserved equal attention. Whoever had sealed these crocks had done it properly with the same thoroughness they'd brought to everything else, and that deserved to be acknowledged before she moved past it. She lifted the nearest crock carefully from the shelf. Heavy, maybe 8 pounds, she could feel liquid shifting inside. The wax seal was cracked along one edge, but still held its basic integrity, and when she tilted the crock slightly, she caught a faint sweetness through the gap. Fruit or honey or both together in some proportion she couldn't yet name. She carried it out to the doorway where the light was better and worked her thumbnail gently under the cloth. The wax gave in flakes. Beneath the cloth, the surface was dark amber, thick a preserved jam or conserve of some kind, still holding its color with only a thin crystallized layer at the very top. She pressed a finger to it and tasted carefully. Plum. Intensely sweet, slightly fermented from the long years, but not spoiled. Still food. She set it down outside the doorway and went back for the second crock. The wax seal on that one had failed more completely, the moisture having gotten in at some point and done its work, and when she lifted the cloth, the surface was white with mold. She set it aside without opening it further. Then she took down the tin box. The hasp latch was stiff, but not locked. She worked it open with her thumbnail and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a square of oilcloth that had gone brittle at the edges, was a bundle. She unfolded it carefully, one corner at a time. Seed packets, a dozen of them hand-labeled in penciled cursive on folded paper. She read them in the morning light coming through the shed door. Plum tomato pole bean, winter squash, sweet corn, dill calendula. A variety of cucumbers she didn't recognize. Two labeled only with drawings, a leaf shape for one, a root shape for another. Someone had saved these seeds from their own plants, cleaned them and dried them and folded them into these small paper envelopes and labeled them and packed them into this box against the possibility that someone would come along later who needed them. Below the seed packets folded twice a single sheet of paper. She unfolded it standing in the doorway and held it up to the light. The handwriting was heavier than the map labels she'd seen on the oilcloth, as though pressed down by something more than the task of record-keeping. The pen had gone through the paper in places, leaving ghost impressions on the back. It was not a letter, not exactly. It was more like a final inventory written for someone who wasn't there yet. It listed what had been built and where. The bridge station, the garden beds, a water line she hadn't found yet described as running from a spring above the clearing to a collection point near the south bed. What still needed to be done. It described the stove damper in the room under the bridge, ran stiff in cold weather, required a second hand to seat properly. It noted that the south garden bed drained poorly in spring and would need the drainage channel extended another 4 feet toward the slope. It mentioned that the wall nearest the river window sometimes wept moisture in heavy rain and had been packed with a clay and sand mix that would need refreshing every few years. She read all of this carefully, following the list through its practical details. The mundane specificity of someone who had thought about maintenance and sustainability and the long, slow work of keeping a place functional. Then she reached the bottom of the sheet. Below the practical notes, separated from them by a small gap that somehow felt like a held breath, a single line that appeared to have been added later. The pencil pressed harder into the page, the letters slightly larger, as if what was being said required more weight than a normal sentence could carry. If you found this, you were looking. That's enough. She stood with the paper in her hands for a long moment. The morning light came gray, and even through the open shed door, the seeds were lined up on the oilcloth beside her. The plum conserve sat in the pale grass outside. The river was audible from here, lower and more distant than it had been in the room under the bridge, but still present, still doing its patient work in the canyon below. If you found this, you were looking. That's enough. She read it 3 more times. Not because she didn't understand the words, she understood the words perfectly. She read it again because she wanted to feel the full weight of what was being said before she responded to it. Before she decided what it meant to her specifically, Mara Calloway, 21 years old, standing in a doorway in the Cascades in October, with a piece of paper in her hands and 41 pounds on her back and no clear destination. She had been looking. She hadn't known what for, not in the way you could write it in a ledger, not in the way she could have explained it to the people who had asked her why she was doing this, why she'd left school, why she was walking through the mountains alone with a pack she'd reinforced with salvaged leather strapping. But she had followed the rails when other people would have turned around. She had stayed on the trestle when the storm said leave. She had gone through the hatch without knowing what the dark held. That counted for something. She folded the paper along its original creases and started to place it back in the tin box. Then she stopped. She turned it over. There was writing on the back. She had missed it when she first unfolded the sheet. The paper had been folded with the writing on the inside, the blank side out, and she had read the front without thinking to check the reverse. Now she held it up to the light and felt something shift in the quality of her attention, the way it shifted when she understood that the drawing she was looking at had more information in it than she'd initially seen. The handwriting on the back was different, not dramatically different. The same general cursive, the same left-handed backward slant she'd noticed on the oilcloth map, but older. The pen had been pressed harder into the page, the letters less even, the line spacing inconsistent in the way that hands became inconsistent when the person holding the pen was writing under conditions that weren't the calm, deliberate conditions of someone making a record for posterity. This had been written in a different state of mind. She read it slowly, tilting the paper to different angles in the doorway light to catch the words where the pencil had gone faint. The writer had come back here. That was the first thing she understood. Had come back to this place alone in the winter of 1961 and had lived here in the room under the bridge, in this shed, in the clearing through the cold months. Had waited, had kept the stove going and the stores provisioned and the lamp burning, and had waited for the people he had told about this place to come. They had not come. She read that sentence twice. They did not come. 4 words flat and declarative with no elaboration, no explanation of why. Just the fact recorded without judgment or self-pity in the way that a person who had spent a long time alone recorded things stripped of the performance that crept into writing when you imagine someone reading it immediately. He had written their names. That was the next thing she read. He had written the names of the people he had been waiting for. Written them on the back of this page first. She thought she could see faint indentations in the paper from a heavier pressing words written and then erased or crossed out or transferred somewhere else. The names were not here anymore. They had been moved, written somewhere else, somewhere more permanent than a piece of paper that could be lost or damaged or destroyed. She looked up from the paper and around the shed interior, then out through the doorway at the clearing, then back at the paper. I wrote their names where they will last, the text continued. In the stone, in the room, above the line of sight where a person only looks when they are looking. She folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket and looked at the tin box for a moment. Then she put the seed packets back in the box carefully, one by one, in the order she'd taken them out. She closed the hasp. She set the box back on the shelf in the corner where she'd found it. She picked up the plum conserve from the grass outside and carried it back into the shed and set it on the lower shelf. She fitted the wax-sealed cloth back over the top as best she could and pressed it down gently. She stood in the doorway one more time and looked at the shed. at the stones and the clay mortar and the wooden shelves and the door that had fought her and then given way. Someone had built this, had mixed that mortar and fitted those stones and hung that door, and thought about drainage and light and the persistence of a place through the indifferent passage of time. She turned and walked back through the clearing. The morning had opened up while she'd been in the shed, the sun climbing above the canyon rim and flattening the shadows. She moved through the raised beds with her eyes down, reading the ground, the way she'd read the structural drawings in the wooden box, looking for the information underneath the surface. The darker soil, the residual geometry of cultivation, the record of work done by hands that were no longer here. She found the drainage channel on the south side of the last raised bed, a shallow trench cut into the mineral soil running from the corner of the bed toward the slope to the southeast. It had silted in over the years, filled with leaf matter and the fine debris that accumulated when running water wasn't there to keep a channel clear. She could see where it had been the slight depression in the ground, the ghost of the original cut, and she could see where it ended. Still 4 feet short of the slope where the ground pitched away sharply enough to carry water freely. She went back to the shed and found the short-handled spade she'd noticed hanging behind the door. The handle was dry and solid. The blade was rusted but intact. She went back to the drainage channel and began. It was not complicated work. It was the kind of work she had learned to value in the past 6 weeks. Physical, immediate, producing visible results in direct proportion to effort applied. She cut the new channel in the same direction as the existing one, following the logic of the original grade, working until the slope ran clean and the pooled water from the overnight rain flowed freely away from the bed's corner. She was not thinking about time. She was thinking about the angle of the cut and the firmness of the soil and the way water would move through this channel in the spring when the snow came off the ridge above and the beds drained their winter saturation. When she was done, she set the spade against the log wall of the nearest bed and straightened up and looked at the channel. 4 feet of new cut, the raw soil dark against the weathered ground around it, connecting the original trench to the slope where it needed to end. She brushed her hands on her pants and went back to the trail. The path back to the bridge was steeper from this direction, and she took the switchbacks more slowly than she had going down. Her legs were good from 6 weeks of this, but the grade was genuine, and there was no reason to hurry. She let herself climb at the pace the hill suggested, breathing steadily, watching the trail ahead for loose rock. She was 2/3 of the way up the second switchback when she saw the footprint. It stopped her completely. Not a deer print, not a boot print from her own descent. An hour ago, she knew her own boot soles, had studied them enough times when she was checking the wear pattern. This was a different sole, a larger print and more recent than any of hers. The mud at the edge of the switchback was still soft from the overnight rain, and the impression was crisp, the tread pattern clear. A man's boot size, 11 or 12. Deep lug sole, the kind sold in sporting goods stores or hunting supply shops. The print was pointed uphill. Someone had come down this trail this morning, before her, or after her. She couldn't tell the timing from the print alone. The mud was uniformly wet, and she had no reference point for how quickly this particular soil held compression. What she could tell was that the print was recent, today, made after the rain stopped and before the morning sun had a chance to begin drying the surface. She stood very still on the switchback and listened. The canyon was quiet, the river below, the wind in the spruce on the far wall, a bird somewhere to her left making a sound she didn't know. She heard nothing else. She moved uphill more carefully than she had been. At the top of the switchback, where the trail leveled before the final approach to the bridge, she found 3 more prints, all pointing uphill, all the same boot. She tracked them to the edge of the brush at the base of the trestle approach, and then lost them on the drier ground of the cut slope where the original graders had cleared the rock. She stopped at the base of the trestle approach and looked up at the bridge deck above her. Nothing moved. The bridge sat in the morning light the way it had been sitting for decades, patient, indifferent, holding itself up against the canyon with the simple permanence of things built to outlast the intentions that created them. She climbed. The trestle felt different in full daylight. She could see through the gaps between the deck boards to the river 40 feet below, the water catching the direct sunlight now, and throwing it back in moving fragments. She could see the full length of the structure from the approach 200 feet of timber and iron, the bents descending into the canyon at regular intervals, the whole thing reading like a structural diagram from one of her old textbooks. Every element in its correct relationship to every other element. She moved across the deck at a pace somewhere between her usual careful progress and something faster. Not running, she didn't run, but faster than careful. She was 3/4 of the way across when her right foot went through. Not all the way through. Her boot broke a deckboard of plank between two ties that had held its surface integrity while losing its structural capacity underneath the rot working from the bottom up, where moisture collected and couldn't drain. The board gave way suddenly and her foot dropped 6 inches before the next intact member caught her boot heel, and for a fraction of a second she was off balance with her weight distributed wrong and the canyon visible through the gap beneath her. She threw her left hand onto the near rail and caught herself. Held there for a moment with her heart doing something rapid and unpleasant behind her ribs, her right foot wedged at an angle in the broken board the river 30 feet below. She breathed. She extracted her foot, carefully testing the adjacent ties before trusting her weight to them. The boot had caught cleanly, no twisted ankle, no real damage. She tested her weight on both feet and found nothing injured. She looked at the broken board for a moment at the dark rod underneath and then continued toward the far end of the bridge at the same pace she'd set before stepping on ties rather than boards, keeping weight on the proven structure. At the east end of the trestle, she found the hatch, still closed. She knelt and felt for the ring and found it and pulled. The hatch opened. She dropped down into the room, fast pulling the hatch closed over her head in one motion, and stood in the dim light with her back against the rock wall and waited. Above her, through the iron and the timber, she heard it. Footsteps on the bridge deck. Not hurrying, not searching, she thought. Not the irregular pause and move pattern of someone looking for something. Just walking. One person moving at a steady pace from the west end of the trestle toward the east, crossing the bridge the way she'd crossed it, stepping on the ties. The footsteps slowed, stopped. She was standing directly below where they stopped. She could hear nothing for a moment except the river, always the river, in her own breathing, which she was trying to make quieter than it was. Then a sound she hadn't expected. 3 knocks, deliberate, evenly spaced. On the deck above her, directly over the hatch. Not the sound of someone testing the structure. Not the random contact of a boot against a loose timber. 3 knocks, each one separated from the next by the same interval, with the quality of communication rather than accident. She stood in the dark below the hatch and did not move. The knocks came again. 3. The same interval. The same quality of intention. She thought about this. She thought about it for the full 15 seconds that elapsed between the second set of knocks and the third. She thought about the footprints in the mud. She thought about the distance from the last town she'd passed through to this bridge, and the difficulty of the trail and the narrowness of the path that had brought her here, which was not a path that people walked accidentally. Whoever was above her had come here on purpose. The third set of 3 knocks, then silence. She reached up and pushed the hatch open. The morning light fell in through the gap. A pair of boots on the bridge deck standing back far enough from the hatch opening to give her room. She climbed up and stood on the bridge and straightened and looked at the person in front of her. He was perhaps 40 years old, maybe slightly more. Work built through the shoulders and forearms in the specific way of men who had spent years doing physical labor with their hands. Not the produced muscle of deliberate exercise, but the practical muscle of sustained use. His jacket was a dark canvas work coat, damp across the shoulders from the morning air, the kind of coat sold in hardware stores and feed suppliers. He had a flashlight in his left hand switched off. His right hand was at his side. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not surprise exactly, because the knocking had told her that he'd known someone was below. Something else. The expression of a person who had arrived at a place they'd been looking for a long time and had found it occupied by someone unexpected. She looked back at him without speaking. The canyon was very quiet. "Walt Decker," he said. His voice was even, not aggressive, Not warm exactly, but not cold. The voice of a man who had learned a long time ago to speak plainly in situations where plain speech was the safest approach. She said her name. He nodded once. He looked at the hatch, which she'd left open, and then back at her. How long, he said. Since yesterday afternoon. The storm. He nodded again. Something in him settled slightly, the particular release of a tension she hadn't known he was carrying. He looked out at the canyon, the same direction the man in the photograph had been looking, and she noticed the echo of that posture, that particular angle of watching, before she understood why she was noticing it. You found the room, he said. It was not a question. Yes. The box. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The river worked below them. She waited because she had learned that waiting was often the right response to silence in a conversation that mattered. My father came up this trail once, he said finally. 1961. He didn't tell me about it until he was dying. He said he'd been looking for something and hadn't found it. He paused. He didn't tell me what. Just that there was a bridge in the Cascades and a trail down to the river and something at the end of the trail that he'd never gotten to. He looked at her. He died in 1987. I've been coming up here since. Every fall. She thought about the stone marker in the clearing, the one she hadn't found yet, the one she would find in an hour after this conversation, after she went back down the trail with this man and saw what he'd been placing stones beside for the past 7 years without fully knowing why. What were you looking for? She said. He looked at the canyon again, then back at her. Same thing you were looking for, I think, he said. I didn't know what it was either. She stood with the canyon wind coming up cold from below, and the morning light hard and clear on the bridge deck, and looked at this man, Walt Decker, 40-some years old, coming up this trail every fall since his father died, looking for something his father had told him was here, without being able to say what it was. She thought about the room below, the drawings, the list of towns, the photograph with the Union badge. She thought about the back of the paper she'd folded into her jacket pocket, the handwriting that was older and harder, and had been written under different conditions than the front. She thought about the names that had been written on a wall somewhere in that room above the line of sight in the stone that would last longer than paper. Come down, she said. There's something you need to see. He looked at the hatch opening in the bridge deck. Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, more like recognition. The way a person looked when something they had half believed turned out to be real. Then before he moved toward the hatch, he paused. I knew to knock, he said. My father's directions mentioned the bridge anchor, the outcropping on the east wall. He said Eli had told him if you ever need to find me, start at the anchor stone. I've been standing on that spot every fall for 7 years. He looked at the hatch in the deck. This morning I felt the boards sound different under my feet. Hollow. I've walked this bridge enough times to know when the deck is solid and when it isn't. She looked at him. You felt the room, she said. I felt the room. He went first. She followed. She pulled the hatch closed over their heads as she descended, and the morning disappeared, and the canyon sounds muffled, and the two of them stood in the dark room below the bridge while she found the matches and struck the first one, and the candle caught. The light came up. The room emerged from the dark in its familiar way, the shelves, the stove, the tools, the narrow window showing the canyon beyond. Walt Decker stood in the center of the room and turned slowly. She watched him take it in the way you absorb something when you had carried its absence for a long time, not cataloging details, but receiving the whole of it. The decision behind the room, she thought. The choice to do this right rather than fast. To build something that would hold rather than something that would merely serve. That was what his face showed understanding of standing in the center of that stone floor. Then she picked up the candle and moved to the far wall and raised it above her head. He came and stood beside her. They both looked up. The names were there. 23 of them carved into the stone at a height that required you to look up to see them above the natural line of sight the way the back of the paper had said. Each one cut cleanly into the rock with a chisel and mallet, the letters an inch tall spaced with care. They had accumulated grime over the decades, the cuts filled with the fine dark dust of years which made them harder to read but also more permanent. The grime was part of them now. The color of the stone and the color of the time together, making something that was neither one alone. She kept the candle raised. Walt Decker read the names one at a time, his lips moving slightly. She watched him move from left to right along the first row and then back to the left for the second. He read slowly. She gave him the time. Halfway through the second row, he stopped. She didn't ask why. She waited. Roy Decker, he said very quietly, the way a person said something they had been a long time arriving at. She looked at the name on the wall. Roy Decker, carved in the same careful hand as the 22 others around it. The same size letters, the same depth of cut, the same care. Not distinguished from the rest. One name among 23 given exactly the same weight as all the others. Walt Decker stood with his hands at his sides and looked at his father's name on the wall of this room, cut into the rock of a canyon in the mountains, where someone had carved it in the winter of 1961 while waiting for the people who did not come. She did not lower the candle. Below them, unseen, the river moved through the canyon the way it always had, without waiting, without watching, without needing to be told that what was happening in this room mattered. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Walt stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the name. Just looked at it. The way you looked at something you had been a long time arriving at, not trying to understand it yet, just letting it be real first. Letting the fact of it settle before you asked it to mean anything. She understood this. She had done this herself, standing in the doorway of the shed with the paper in her hands and those last words sitting in her like a stone dropped into still water. You had to let the weight land before you could measure the depth. After a while, he reached up and touched the letters with his fingertip. Not tracing them, just touching. The way you confirm that something was solid. Then he lowered his hand and stepped back and looked at the room. She lowered the candle. Her shadow swung large across the far wall and settled. He told me there was a man named Eli, Walt said. His voice was even still, but something underneath it had changed, some quality of held tension that had been there since she'd first heard him speak on the bridge deck above, released now, or at least loosened. He didn't use a last name. He said this man had come to the house in October of 1959, 2 weeks after my father lost his job, and had sat at the kitchen table and told him there was a place in the mountains where he could go if things got worse. He paused. He said the man had a folded piece of paper with directions written on it, numbers and landmarks, and that he'd memorized it before he gave it back. She looked at the candle flame. He memorized it and gave it back. My father said the man told him he was going to need the paper himself, that he couldn't leave it. She thought about the oilcloth map in the drawer under the workbench, the 3 keys on the plain ring, the stub of pencil worn to the ferrule. A man who was still using his own map, still revising it, still traveling the circuit of towns and crossed out names. Your father never came, she said. No. Walt moved to the workbench and looked at the surface of it, the tool marks, the old stains, the worn patch where hands had rested repeatedly in the same position. He said things got bad, and then they got worse, and then somehow they got bearable again. The way things did. He got work in a mill outside of Medford. Not the same work, not the same wages, but enough. He ran a hand along the bench surface. He said he always meant to come, to see what was here. But by the time things were stable enough that he could leave for a week, enough time had passed that he said it felt like it would be intruding. Like whoever was here had moved on and he had no right to walk into the middle of it. She thought about that, the particular geometry of waiting for someone who had decided not to impose. He talked about it more at the end, Walt continued. When he was sick, he said he'd made a mistake by not coming, that he owed someone a thank you that he'd never delivered. He looked at the wall of names. He didn't know there was anything written up there. He just knew there was a place. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the folded paper, the one from the tin box in the shed. She unfolded it and held it out to him. He read the front first. She watched his eyes move through the practical inventory, the stove damper, the drainage channel, the wall by the river window. The handwriting of a man who thought in terms of maintenance and persistence and what a place needed to remain functional. He read it the way she had read it. She thought not just for the information, but for the quality of attention it represented. Then she turned it over. He read the back more slowly. She watched him read it, and she did not watch his face because some things deserve the privacy of being felt without an audience. She looked instead at the wall of names and counted them again silently the way she had been counting them since Walt had lowered his hand from his father's name. 23 names. 23 men who had been told about this place and had not come. And one man who had waited for all of them through a winter that no record she'd found, had described in a room no one knew existed, and had carved their names in stone before he left. He wrote it for himself, Walt said quietly. Not a question. I think so. I think the front was for whoever came next, and the back was for him. She paused. He needed to record that he had waited, that he had kept the place ready, that the failure wasn't the place, it was the circumstances. Walt folded the paper carefully along its original creases and held it for a moment. Then he looked at her. What happened to him? She had been thinking about this since she found the photographs in the list and the plans in the wooden box. She had been assembling it the way she assembled structural drawings, finding the load paths, following the forces, understanding how each element transferred its weight to the elements below it. I don't know exactly, she said, but the list of towns, the one in the box, I've been thinking about the pattern of it, the check marks and the crossouts. She moved to the crate and lifted the wooden box onto the workbench and opened it. She took out the list and spread it on the surface and angled the candlelight over it. Walt came and stood beside her. These towns with check marks, she said, running her finger along the left column. He reached these people. He found them. The crossouts, these are the ones who had already moved on before he got there, left no forwarding address or moved somewhere he couldn't trace. She looked up at him. He was doing this systematically, going town to town, tracking down every man on that list, making sure each one knew about this place. Walt studied the list. His finger found the entry for Medford, a check mark. My father, he said. He found him, sat at your kitchen table and gave him the directions. She paused. And then he kept going, all the way through this list. She counted the check marks. 17 check marks, 6 crossouts. He found 17 of them. Walt was quiet for a moment, but he came back here. In the winter of 1961, after he'd finished the list, she looked at the names on the wall. He came back and waited. Why did no one come? She had thought about this too. Standing in the shed doorway with the plum conserve and the seed packets, walking the drainage channel with the short-handled spade. The question underneath the practical work, the question she was turning over while her hands were occupied with something she could measure and complete. Because things got bearable, she said. The way your father said. Things got bad and worse and then somehow bearable again. People found other work, other arrangements. The moment when they might have come, that specific window, when a place in the mountains with a winter's worth of supplies felt like the right answer, passed. For all 17 of them. She paused. Life doesn't hold still long enough for most contingency plans to be needed. Walt looked at the wall, at the names. He carved them anyway. He carved them anyway. She put the list back in the box and closed it. She stood back from the workbench and looked at the room as a whole, the shelves, the stove, the tools on the pegboard, the narrow window with the canyon beyond it. The room in full morning light was different from the room in candlelight. Less dramatic, more present, more like a place where a person actually worked and lived rather than a setting from a story. She could see now in the cleaner light details she'd missed in the dark. The way the timber shelves had been planed smooth on the upper surface, but left rough on the underside, the economy of someone working alone, who understood which surfaces mattered and which didn't. The way the pegboard strip for the tools had been leveled with a small shim of cedar wedged behind the low end precisely calibrated so that the tools hung plumb. The small marks on the wall beside the stove where height had been measured repeatedly, a series of pencil scratches at different levels. The record of checking something over time, though she couldn't tell what. "I want to show you something," she said. She picked up the candle and moved to the far wall below the names. She angled the light upward and to the left toward the corner where the ceiling met the rock. Walt came and stood beside her. In the corner, partially hidden by the angle of the vault overhead, there was something she had noticed the night before and not fully understood in the dark. A bracket, iron hand-forged, mounted to the stone wall at about chest height. Simple, just a horizontal arm extending 6 inches from the wall with a small upturned hook at the end. Below it, barely visible, a corresponding hole drilled in the floor with a thin iron rod set into it. A frame. The bracket and the rod were the two anchors of a folding frame, the kind used for a cot or a narrow bed. She had seen this hardware in a military surplus catalog, once the kind of thing issued to soldiers who needed to sleep in confined spaces and needed the bed to fold flat against the wall when it wasn't in use. The canvas or rope webbing that would have formed the sleeping surface was gone, rotted away, or removed at some point. But the hardware remained. This room had been designed to sleep a person in reasonable comfort. The chair she'd slept in wasn't the intended accommodation. Walt reached out and touched the bracket, tested it with his thumb. The iron didn't move. "Good work," he said. She thought about her father's union card in the back of his wallet, about the mill that had closed and the years that had followed, and the things that had and hadn't been said about any of it. About the way certain kinds of skill and certain kinds of loss accumulated in families without being directly discussed, passed down not through conversation but through the quality of attention a person brought to the things they made with their hands. "He was a good builder," she said. "Both of them were." Walt looked at the drawings still spread on the workbench. The cross-section of the hatch mechanism, the chimney channel diagram, the elevation of the window with its angled sill. "These plans, you need 2 people for this. You can't cut a chimney channel through 30 feet of rock by yourself. You need someone above and someone below, someone reading the instrument and someone running the drill." She hadn't thought about this. She looked at the plans again with Walt's observations sitting on top of them, and she saw the coordination embedded in the design. The way certain measurements were noted from 2 different reference points, the way the chimney channel had been laid out, using triangulation that required 2 fixed positions to establish. 2 people, working together underground over a period of months on a project that could not be explained to anyone. "The man in the photograph," she said, "the one looking at the canyon, that's your father." Walt looked at her. She went to the box and found the photograph and handed it to him. He held it at the angle that caught the candlelight best and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "I never saw this photograph," he said finally. "I didn't know it existed. It was in the box, under the plans." He studied the image. She watched him look at his father, at the Union badge on the lapel, at the posture of a man watching something on the canyon rim, at the presence of him in this place. At this time, young and alive, and standing on a bridge, he had helped to make into something it wasn't designed to be. "He never talked about it," Walt said. "About any of this. I knew about the mill, about losing the job, about the lean years after, but not this." He looked up. Not that he knew a man who was doing something about it, not that he'd been part of it, even a small part. She thought about that, about the things that got left out of the versions of the past that families passed down, about the gap between what had happened and what got said about what had happened, and how that gap accumulated over years, until it was larger than the events themselves. "Maybe he didn't think it counted," she said. "It never got used. Nobody came. Whatever they were trying to build," she gestured at the room, "it didn't work the way they intended." Walt looked at his father's name on the wall. "He came to the house," he said. "Eli Marsh came to the house and sat at the kitchen table and told my father there was a place to go if things got worse. That's not nothing." He paused. That's a man deciding that someone else's survival mattered enough to cross a mountain range in October and sit down at a stranger's table. He looked at her. That's not nothing, even if nobody ever came. She stood with that for a moment. Then she put the photograph back in the box and picked up the short-handled spade she'd carried up from the shed and propped against the wall when she came in. "Help me with the wall," she said. He looked at the spade, then at her. "The trowel's in the tool roll," she said. "River clay and coarse sand from the bank below. The paper said it needed refreshing every few years. It's been more than a few years." He was quiet for a moment. Then he unrolled the tool canvas on the workbench and found the widest chisel and held it up. "This'll work better than a trowel for packing." "That's what I thought, too." They went down to the river. The bank below the bridge approach was narrow, but accessible, the gravel giving way to a clay deposit where the canyon wall met the waterline. She had noticed it on her way back up from the clearing, the distinctive gray-blue of good structural clay, the kind that had enough plasticity to pack tight and enough grit to hold its shape when it dried. She dug out a double handful and worked it in her fingers, feeling for consistency. Good. Dense and cold from the river, with just enough moisture already in it. She looked at Walt. He was crouched beside her, rolling a flat stone in his hands, testing its weight the way a person tested things they were considering using. "You do this kind of work," she said. "Welding, structural, same as my father, more or less." He set the stone down and started filling his jacket pockets with river gravel, the coarser fraction, the pieces the size of a thumbnail that would give the mix its body. "I've patched enough masonry in my time." They carried the clay and the gravel back up to the room in 2 loads, using the folded oilcloth as a makeshift container for the wet material. The wall beside the river window showed the weeping. She'd noticed a vertical seam where the natural rock and the cut stone of the window frame didn't quite bond the trace of moisture that ran down in heavy rain and left a gray stain on the floor below. She'd packed it with her palm the night before, pushing in the loose material she'd found in the crevice, but it needed more than that. Walt worked the clay and gravel on the workbench surface, mixing them by hand, adding small amounts of coarse sand from the store on the shelf until he had a consistency he approved of. She watched him work. He mixed with the flat of his hand rather than his fingers, the same motion she'd seen plasterers use, reading the material through the broad contact surface, understanding its quality through the feel of it against the whole palm rather than just the tips. He pressed the first application into the seam with the chisel, working it in from the bottom and smoothing upward, overlapping each stroke with the next. She angled the light toward the seam where he was working. "He would have been 63 this year," Walt said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the wall, at the seam, at the work in his hands. She held the candle steady at the angle he needed. "Same age as my father would have been," he said. "Give or take a year." He pressed another application of clay into the upper part of the seam and smoothed it down. "I spent a lot of years being angry at him for not telling me about any of this, for letting it just sit there in him all those years without saying it out loud." "What changed?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. The chisel moved along the seam. "He showed me the scar on his hand," Walt said, "the week before he died. He held it up and said this was from a man named Eli, who had believed that what Roy Decker did with his hands was worth something, that the work he knew how to do was worth preserving." He paused. I didn't understand what he meant, but I remembered it. She thought about the list of 23 names, about Eli Marsh going town to town through a 100-mile radius, sitting at kitchen tables saying what you know how to do is worth something. "There is a place for you. Here are the directions. Come if you need to." He was trying to make sure the skills didn't disappear, she said. The men on that list, they were all tradesmen, miners, steel workers, men who knew how to work with their hands in ways that were being made economically inconvenient. He was building a place where those skills could sustain someone, where they'd be worth having again. Walt finished the seam and stepped back and looked at it. The clay was lighter than the surrounding stones, still wet, but the application was even and solid. In a week, it would be the color of the rock around it. "He didn't save anyone," Walt said. "Nobody came. Nobody used it. But you came," she said. "Every year. You put a stone on that marker in the clearing even though you didn't know why it was there. He looked at her. And she came, she said, meaning herself. I followed a line on a map because it didn't go anywhere logical, and I stayed on a bridge in a storm because the alternative was retreating, and I went through a hatch in the dark because some part of me needed to know what was on the other side of it. She looked at the names on the wall, at Roy Decker's name among the others. The work doesn't disappear just because nobody came, she said. It's here. You can see where the chisel worked the stone. You can put your hand on the seam and feel where someone mixed clay with river gravel and packed it so it would hold. She looked at him. It held. Walt looked at the freshly packed seam. Then he looked at his hands, clay-stained, the knuckles showing the wear of years of work, the scar on the right palm that his father had shown him the week before he died. She set the candle on the workbench and picked up the short-handled spade. There's a drainage channel in the south bed that needs another 4 feet, she said. I started it this morning. I want to finish it before the light goes. He looked at her. Something in his face that she didn't try to name, something between the particular grief of understanding a thing too late and the particular relief of understanding it at all. I saw the channel, he said, on my way up through the clearing. It should have been done years ago. The note said so. I didn't know about the note. You know now. He looked at the wall one more time, at the 23 names in their careful rows carved in stone above the line of sight in the dark room beneath the bridge, where the river ran below and the mountain held everything together with the patience of old stone. Then he picked up the wider chisel from the workbench and put it in his coat pocket. They went down the trail together in the afternoon light. The clearing was warmer than the canyon below the south-facing exposure, catching the last of the direct sun. She found the channel where she'd left it, and he took it from the point she'd stopped, and she worked the adjacent section, and they moved toward the slope in tandem, working in the quiet way that people worked when they didn't need to explain to each other what they were doing because the task explained itself. An hour of this, the sound of the spade blade in the soil, in the river below, and the wind moving through the aspen at the clearing's edge. The late afternoon light going amber and then something softer than amber as the sun dropped toward the canyon rim. When the channel reached the slope and the pooled water from the base of the south bed began to flow freely away. She set the spade against the log wall and straightened up and looked at the work. Walt was standing at the far end of the channel at the slope where the new cut connected to the grade. He pressed the toe of his boot against the soil above the outlet and watched the water move. Clean, he said. She nodded. They walked the rows of raised beds in the low light. She told him about the seeds in the tin box, the plum tomato and the pole bean, and the 2 packets with only drawings for labels. He told her that his father had kept a kitchen garden until he got too sick to work it, that the last thing the old man had asked him to do was save the bean seeds from the last crop before the frost took them, that Walt had done it and still had them somewhere in a drawer in his kitchen. Pole beans, she said. He looked at her. How did you know that? She thought about the packet with the hand-drawn label, the careful cursive of a man who had grown these beans and saved these seeds and put them in a tin box in a stone shed in a canyon in the mountains because he believed that someone would come, eventually, who would know what to do with them. I didn't, she said. Not for certain. Buff. She was moving toward the shed to put the spade back when Walt stopped. She turned. He was standing at the far corner of the clearing at the edge of the brush where the birch tree had grown up through the wall of the shed, lifting the cornerstones. Not looking at the tree, looking down. She came and stood beside him. It was a flat stone, roughly rectangular, maybe 18 inches long, set into the ground at a slight angle the way ground frost moved things over decades. No name on it, no inscription. Just a date cut shallowly into the face with a chisel. November 1961. And below the date, the beginning of a second line. The chisel mark stopped mid-stroke. Someone had begun to carve a name. She could see the first vertical cut of what might have been an E or an I or an L and had stopped. Set the chisel down and not picked it up again. The ground below the stone was undisturbed. Whatever had been intended here had not been finished, or had been reconsidered. Walt crouched and pressed 2 fingers flat against the unfinished cut. The stone was cold and solid under his hand. He was going to put a name, Walt said. She looked at the incomplete letter. The depth of the first cut was deliberate, committed, then nothing. He changed his mind, she said. She paused, looking at the stone, at the date carved clean and complete above the abandoned line. Or there was no name to put. Walt looked up at her. She thought about what that meant, a man in the winter of 1961 alone in a canyon who had cut a date into stone and then lowered the chisel, who had prepared to mark a death or a departure or an ending, and had then decided that what had happened here was not something that fit on a stone, that what needed recording was not a name but an absence, not a loss but a choice. He had stayed. He had outlasted the winter he had prepared for others. And when he finally left, he had left no name because the name was still in the world somewhere, still moving through it, still carrying what it knew. He stayed, she said finally. He outlasted it. Walt stood. He looked at the stone for a long moment. Then he reached down and picked up a flat river rock from near the base of the shed wall and placed it on top of the carved stone, the way you placed a stone on a grave, or on a threshold, or on a promise. The gesture his hands had been making for 7 years without his mind fully knowing why. She watched him do it. It was a small thing, and it was not a small thing, and she did not say anything because some gestures had more weight than the words you could put around them. They went back to the room under the bridge as the light was failing. She repacked the river wall with a final application of clay, and he smoothed it flat with the back of the chisel, and they stood back and looked at it in the candlelight. She found the birch bark in the wood box and laid a small fire in the stove, and he seated the damper with a second hand, the way the note had described, one holding the handle, one pressing the collar flat, and the fire drew clean, the smoke going straight up through the channel in the rock without backing into the room. She heated 2 of the cans from the shelf over the stove. Beans, she thought, though, there was no label to confirm it. They ate from the cans, sitting on opposite sides of the workbench with the candle between them and the fire making its small sound in the stove, and the river audible through the window in the way it was always audible here, not as background noise, but as a kind of ground the thing underneath everything else that gave the rest of it its context. She put the photograph on the workbench between them face up. Walt looked at it for a long time in the candlelight. At his father's profile, the angle of watching the Union badge on the lapel. He looks like himself, Walt said finally. I know that sounds like a strange thing to say about a photograph, but he looks like the person I knew, not younger, just the same way of standing. She looked at the photograph, at the man looking away from the camera at something on the canyon rim or in the air above it. What was he watching for, she said. Walt shook his head slowly. I used to think I knew. When I was young, before he got sick, I thought he was the kind of man who was always watching for trouble, always waiting for the next thing to go wrong. He was quiet for a moment, but I think now he was watching for the opposite. I think he was watching to see if it was going to be all right. She looked at the photograph, at the man who had helped build this room and had not come when the room was ready and had carried it in him for 30 years before he showed his son the scar on his hand and tried to explain what it meant. Was it? She said. All right. Walt looked at her. The candlelight moved between them. Mostly, he said, in the ways that mattered. He looked at the wall of names. I think that's all you get, mostly in the ways that mattered. She thought about that. She thought about her father's union card in the back of his wallet about the mill in the years after. She thought about the structures course and the 3 notebooks full of load calculations she had loved before she stopped going. She thought about 41 pounds on a postal scale and a discard bin outside a library in Roseburg and a pencil scratch on a piece of government survey paper that ended in the middle of a mountain because the story it was telling hadn't finished yet. She thought about the man who had built this room and what it had cost him and what he'd hoped for and what he'd found when he came back in the winter of 1961 to wait. And she thought about what it meant to carve 23 names into stone, not as a record of failure, but as a record of care, as a statement that these men had been known, that someone had gone to each of their towns and sat at their tables and told them that what they knew how to do was worth something. That was not nothing. After a while, Walt put the photograph in his jacket pocket. She looked at him. "Your father's photograph," she said. "You should have it." He shook his head. "It belongs here." He put his hand flat on the workbench surface for a moment, the same gesture she'd made herself, testing the quality of the floor the night before. "Leave it in the box. Let it stay." She put the photograph back in the wooden box and closed the lid and set it in the crate where she'd found it. She pressed the dry goods back around it. She arranged the jars and the cans the way she'd found them, or close to it, the order of a pantry that was meant to work. The fire had gone to coals. She banked it with a piece of split fir from the wood box and adjusted the damper to a slow draw. The room would hold heat for hours. Walt stood at the window. She came and stood beside him. Below, in the full dark of the canyon, the river was invisible but present, that constant low sound that came up through the stone and into the soles of your feet, the pulse the mountain kept for itself. "I'll come back next year," he said, "the year after, the way I have been." "The beds need work," she said. "The soil is still good, but the log walls are going. Another few years and they'll be flat." "I know how to build a raised bed." She nodded. She believed him. "What about you?" he said. She thought about the answer before she gave it. Not performing the thinking, actually doing it. Actually asking herself the question that he was asking her, "What about you?" She had no plan. She had never had a plan. Not really. She had a direction and a willingness to follow it, which was different from a plan. Plans implied a destination, and destinations implied that you knew in advance what the endpoint looked like. And she had spent 6 weeks learning that the things worth finding were the things you couldn't have described before you found them. "I don't know," she said. "I don't know yet." He nodded. He didn't push. He left just before full dark. She walked with him to the east end of the trestle and watched him take the trail up from the bridge approach to wherever he'd left his vehicle, somewhere above the canyon. She assumed on a logging road or a Forest Service track that she hadn't found because she'd come up from the valley rather than down from the ridge. Before he went down the approach, he turned back. "He was right," Walt said. "Eli, about my father's hands, about what they were worth." He looked at his own hands in the last of the light. "I learned everything I know from my father. He learned from the men he worked with. Those men," he paused, "some of them are on that wall." She stood at the end of the trestle with the canyon below and the mountain above, and the night coming in around her. "I know," she said. He went down the trail and the timber closed around him, and she stood on the bridge deck in the dark for a long time after she could no longer hear his footsteps. She went back to the room. She lit the candle from the coals in the stove and carried it to the workbench and sat down and opened her notebook to a fresh page. The notebook was half full now, 6 weeks of trail notes and weather observations, and the accumulated practical knowledge of moving through a landscape every day with attention. The page she turned to was the first completely blank one. The white of it seemed significant in the candlelight, a surface waiting for what came next. She sat with the pen in her hand for a moment. She thought about what she had been looking for when she picked up the survey map in the library discard bin in Roseburg 3 weeks ago. She thought about what she had not been able to say when people asked her why she had left school, why she was doing this, where she was going. She had not had an answer. She had had only the sense that the answer existed somewhere, and that moving toward it was better than standing still and waiting for it to arrive. She had found a room cut into the rock of a canyon by a man who believed that other people's skills were worth preserving. A man who had done the work of 17 kitchen tables and 1 winter of waiting and 23 names in stone, not because it succeeded by any conventional measure of success, but because the work itself was the point. The care was the point. The names on the wall were not a record of failure. They were a record of the only thing that actually lasted. She put the pen to the page. She wrote her name first, Mara Calloway. The letters of it plain and clear in her own handwriting. The handwriting she'd been using since 2nd grade, the one that hadn't changed in the way she'd changed in other ways. Then below it, she began to write the inventory. Not the inventory of the room she had that already on the pages behind this one. This was a different inventory. The inventory she had been assembling for 6 weeks without knowing that was what she was doing. The things she knew, the things she had learned, the things that 6 weeks of carrying 41 pounds through mountain terrain had taught her about load and grade and the difference between sustainable pace and unsustainable pace, about when to stop and when to keep going, about the quality of attention required to read a landscape the way some people read books, the things her structures courses had given her before she stopped going, the things she still knew how to do with a drawing and a pencil, and the understanding of how forces move through a system. The things this room had taught her, about what it meant to build something for someone you hadn't met yet, about the patience required to make work that held, about the difference between building to be seen and building to last, and how those two things almost never pointed in the same direction. She wrote about the hatch mechanism and how the counterweight had been designed and how it had seized over the decades, and what that told her about the oxidation rate of unprotected iron in a humid canyon environment. She wrote about the chimney channel and the trigonometric approach that had been used to lay it out, and how two people with a level and a plumb line and enough patience could bore a straight channel through 30 feet of fractured rock. She wrote about the raised beds and the south orientation and the soil amendment that had preserved the tilth of the ground for decades past the last cultivation. She was not sure when she stopped being a former architecture student who had dropped out in the middle of her second year and became something else. Something that didn't have a name yet on a transcript or a resume or any official document. But the change had something to do with this room and this notebook, in the particular quality of work that surrounded her. The work of a man who had understood that what you built outlasted you, and that this was not a sad thing, but the whole point. She wrote for a long time. Outside the canyon held its dark. The mountain held everything. The way mountains held things without preference, without judgment, without any opinion about what deserved to last and what deserved to be forgotten. The stone was just stone. The names carved into it were just letters. But the combination of the two, the human intention meeting the geologic patience, produced something that was neither one alone. She filled the page and turned to the next one. She wrote about the footprint on the switchback, about the 3 knocks and the 15 seconds she had spent thinking before she opened the hatch, about what it felt like to make a decision in the dark based on incomplete information and have it turn out to be the right one, not because you had been smart or careful, but because you had been paying attention, and paying attention over a long time had given you a kind of knowledge that wasn't in any book she'd ever been assigned. She wrote about the stone in the corner of the clearing, about the incomplete letter below the date, about the way some things didn't need to be finished to be understood. She wrote about Walt's hands when he packed the clay into the wall seam, the particular motion of reading material through the palm rather than the fingertips, the way that knowledge passed from person to person, not through formal instruction, but through proximity and observation, and the gradual accumulation of shared work. How Roy Decker had learned something from Eli Marsh on those night sessions under the bridge and had carried it in his hands for 30 years and had passed it to his son without ever explaining what he was passing, and how Walt had carried it in his hands and hadn't known its origin until this morning. She thought about her father's union card. She thought about the 3 notebooks of calculations she had filled before she stopped going to classes now, in a box somewhere in a storage unit in Corvallis. The calculations torn out of this one and replaced with trail notes and weather observations. She thought about whether those two things, the structural calculations and the trail notes, were really as different as she had assumed when she made the decision to replace one with the other. Both were records of attention. Both were attempts to understand how forces move through a system. Both were attempts to know the weight of things. She was still writing when the second candle burned low enough to pool at the base of its jar. She lit a third from the coals, not because she had planned to write this long, but because the writing was doing something she hadn't expected it to do, something that felt less like recording and more like arriving. She wrote about the seed packets, about the pole bean seeds in the tin box and the pole bean seeds in a drawer in a kitchen in Medford that had come from the same original source, the same hands, the same belief that growing things carried forward something that the people who grew them had wanted to preserve. She wrote about plum conserve that had outlasted its maker by 3 decades and still tasted of plums. She thought about returning, not just to this room, though she would return to this room. She understood that now, with the same certainty, she understood that the raised beds needed new log walls before the next spring, but to the whole practice of it, the practice of paying attention to what needed doing and then doing it, of reading the record that work left in a place and adding to that record rather than simply observing it. She had left school because she had not been able to explain why she was there. She had not been able to explain what the design studios and the history lectures were preparing her for in a way that made the preparation feel worth the cost. But she had not stopped being interested in structures. She had not stopped being interested in how things held together, how load transferred through a joint, how a place expressed the intentions of the people who had built it. Those interests had just been waiting for a context that made sense of them. She thought about the cross-section drawings in the wooden box, the precision of them. The way they had been drawn after the work was finished as a record for someone else to understand. Documentation not of the design, but of the built thing, the thing as it actually existed rather than as it had been imagined. That was a different kind of drawing than anything she had been asked to make in school. It was the kind of drawing that assumed the primary value was in the existing thing, not in the concept that had preceded it. She put the cap on the pen and closed the notebook and sat back in the chair. The room was warm. The damper was drawing clean. The wall beside the window held its repair, the clay still slightly lighter than the surrounding stone, drying toward the color of the rock around it. The 23 names waited on the wall above the line of sight in the dark that was not total in the rock that would hold them past the reach of any record she could make. She looked at the window. Below, invisible in the dark, the river moved. She could hear it the way you heard something you had learned to trust, not always consciously, not always with full attention, but always there. The sound the whole place breathed. The sound the mountain kept going with through weather and seasons, in the long, patient interval between the people who found their way here. She understood, sitting in that chair in that room under the bridge in the mountains of Oregon, that she would come back here. Not next week, not next month maybe, but she would come back the way Walt came back, with something to do, something the place needed, something she had learned in the interval that would be useful here. The drainage channel, the wall, the names that needed clearing of their grime, so they could be read more easily in the years ahead, when the accumulated dark of the cuts made them harder to see rather than easier. The raised beds that would collapse in a few more years unless someone rebuilt the log walls. There would always be something. That was what the note on the front of the paper had understood. The list of things still needing to be done was not a record of inadequacy. It was the shape of continuing attention. The acknowledgement that a place in the world required ongoing care, and that providing that care was a form of belonging that no deed or title could replicate. A place only became yours through the work you put into it, not through ownership, not through paperwork, through the stove you seasoned and the wall you repacked and the drainage ditch you extended 4 feet toward the slope because someone before you had noted it needed doing, and the noting was itself a kind of trust. She was 21 years old. She had a room in the rock with a stove that drew clean and a window that showed the canyon and 23 names above the line of sight and a notebook that was only just beginning to hold everything she needed to say. She knew the weight of her pack to the pound. She knew how to read a drawing. She knew what it felt like to go through a hatch in the dark without knowing what the dark held, and to find on the other side not danger, but the record of someone who had been here before and had left the place better than they found it, and had hoped without knowing that someone would come along eventually who was paying enough attention to continue the work. She closed her eyes in the chair and listened to the river and let the mountain hold her, and the room held its warmth around her, the way stone always held warmth. Slowly accumulated, slowly released the thermal memory of a place that had been lived in. Somewhere above in the rock, the names waited in the patient way that carve things, waited outlasting the hands that made them, and the intentions that drove those hands, and the seasons that had passed since holding. Only what they had always held. The record of people who had been known in a room that no one was supposed to find, by a man who had understood that knowing someone, truly knowing them, enough to carve their name in stone and keep the stove burning, and the provisions stocked against the possibility of their arrival, was not something that required their presence to be real. The river moved below in the dark. The mountain held everything. The candle burned toward its end. And Mara Calloway, 21 years old, former architecture student, walker of abandoned railroad grades, keeper of a notebook full of useful things, sat in a chair in a room cut into the living rock of a canyon in the Cascades and breathed the same air that had sustained a man through a winter 30 years before, and felt for the first time in a long time the particular weight of being exactly where she was supposed to be.